headquarters for Net Translators?
The headquarters is in Israel.
In Israel. Okay.
All right, and I just started the recording. This said, I would like to welcome everybody to today's webinar presentation of Top 5 Tips to Enhance Your Terminology Management IQ, Strategies from the Field. This webinar is definitely geared toward professionals from the medical and biotech industries, but most certainly applicable to anyone managing terminology or involved in localization and translation. This said, I'm super excited to have with us today our guest presenter, Marita Hör. She's the Senior Software Localization Manager at Terumo BCT. And Marita, you're also here in Colorado. I'm in Boulder. You're in Lakewood.
Yes, I'm 25 miles away from you.
Haha, and we're both getting pounded with snow today.
Yeah.
That's for sure. All right, Rita, you're a 20-year veteran of the localization industry. You have a master's degree in applied linguistics from the Johannes Gutenberg University in Germany. And actually, why don't you just tell us a couple of sentences about yourself before I introduce David?
So, well, yes, I at some point got a degree in applied linguistics and was thinking I'm going to work as a translator, and I did that for many years. I specialized in the medical field translation, and then I moved into management on the vendor side and did that for many years, and 7 years ago I had the pleasure, and when I say I had the pleasure, I really mean it. Had the pleasure to create a software localization team here at Terumo BCT, and that's what I've been doing for the last 7 years. What else can I say?
That's good enough. Great.
Okay.
Let me, again, thanks a lot for joining us today for this presentation. Then also with us, we have David Sommer. David is the Director of Strategic Operations at Net Translators. David, what exactly are you doing? And who will win the World Series this year? I think you're a big baseball fan.
Well, judging by recent performance, it's not going to be my team, the Mets. So after that, it really doesn't matter. But you know, never rule out the Yankees. You know, once you put a Yankee uniform on, you're just, you know, it doesn't matter who you are. You're just going to win a game. So you asked what I do for Net Translators.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm in my 10th year with Net Translators. I started out as a project manager and then became senior localization project manager. After that, they sort of said, well, listen, you're doing all this other stuff included. You know, let's move you over to the pre-sale, post-sale side so you can bridge between clients' needs and operational issues. So that's, and besides, I know where all the bodies are buried. So today I'm the Director of Strategic Operations.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. Okay, this said, I want to let you know, we have a poll ready. I'm not sure if we want to do it now or if we should wait a couple of slides. We still have people joining us. David, let's get started, and then I'll just interrupt you when I think it's probably time for the first poll. So this said, David, Marita, it's all you guys.
Alrighty. Well, I think I speak for myself as well as Chris and Marita here when I say that what we would like to achieve today is to make sure that you come away with the basic understanding of the importance of terminology management, as well as a basic tool set which will empower you to take the steps needed in order to kickstart your own program. We will hopefully introduce you to basic terminology management, understand how you engage multiple stakeholders, and give you enough information to draw conclusions about your own processes. So essentially 5 things are on our agenda today. We're going to look at the importance of terminology, and certainly that can't be understated. Look at the basics of terminology. Look at a couple of theoretical issues in terminology. We'll get a fantastic case study in how a real-life application of terminology management. And we're going to show you how to begin even if you've already started in your localization processes. So typically, I like to start my presentations with a clever quote from a brilliant mind, someone often quoted like Winston Churchill, John Steinbeck, etc. This topic, however, made me think that in terminology management, we are simply trying to boil down language's essence to a simple meaning. I therefore chose this quote in order to try and communicate that we must keep in mind that the ultimate goal in managing terminology, and of course, who wouldn't laugh at George Carlin? So let's take a look at a simple one-word term in order to get an introduction to terminology. As I mentioned, I've been in this business for more than a decade, and I cannot tell you how many times someone has asked us to just translate. There's no need to extract terminology. It's a simple user's guide. Everybody knows how to use this one. Depending upon the industry, I then try to draw conclusions about their content and their industry. Of course, if I wanted to use a generic example, I usually use the word file. But now let's take a look at a term nearer and dearer to me, the word strike. I'm not sure what conclusions you have come to just looking at the word on the screen, but I think in terms of sport and labor. Believe me, I've struck out enough times to know that this word is plenty powerful. But let's take a look a little more deeply at this word. In the example here, I give 4 possible options to the meaning. Each one is decidedly different and may or may not be used in the same content set. Or would it? Say, for example, that you were talking about a base strike as a work action. The meaning then changes. While in English you can still get away with it, you will no doubt have a much harder time in other languages. This doesn't even begin to address the fact that it could also be different parts of speech. Again, this is okay in English, but if you look at the Japanese, you will get a completely different understanding of the complexities involved. Each word is obviously different and therefore needs to be well defined. Incidentally, you will see a similarity between strike as a work action in the Japanese and strike as a baseball term, again in the Japanese. This is because the etymology of the 2 words is similar. In this case, they were both adopted from the English. And according to my linguist, it's pronounced strike. I'm sure I did not pronounce that correctly. Okay, so now taking this from the theoretical to real life, I wanted to use the example here to emphasize that something that may seem obvious to us may not be so obvious, especially to someone who may not be an expert at your product. The example I wanted to use was about a word contained as part of a term. The word in question was rapid, which formed a product name similar to what you see on the screen, Intel Rapid Storage Technology. However, due to the fact that the company in question skipped the terminology stage in the project, and it was not Intel, I'll tell you that already. The translator translated this particular term as the equivalent of quickly. This obviously has an impact that negates any measure of quality. So here is a classic example of why it is important to manage terminology. And looking at the bottom example, and I want to tend to believe that this was done intentionally, I hope. So if spell check had been managed as a monolingual term, then I'm reasonably confident that this second example wouldn't have occurred either if it was unintentional.
Hey, David?
Yeah.
Why don't we take the quick poll right now, and I'm going to launch the poll for everybody. So right now on your screen, you should see our poll. Do you currently have a terminology management process in place? Your answers or choices are yes, no, planning on it, not sure. And then we'll share the results of the poll with the audience. So maybe if you haven't already casted your vote, if you can do so in the next 15 to 20 seconds. David, what do you predict?
I'm going to predict I don't know.
Let's see. Okay, maybe another 5 seconds. All right, 2, 1. I'm going to close the poll, and I'm going to share the results. David, David, Marita, can you guys see the results?
Yes.
All right, so 48.
I actually cannot. I'm not sure why not.
So I'm going to rattle it down. So 48% of our audience says yes, 12 no, 24 are planning on it %, and 15% are not sure. So this said, I'm going to hide the poll, and David, back to you.
All right. That's more or less, I think, a result that, given our understanding of the market, is pretty indicative. So the first thing that I want to point out here is that if you are a terminology novice, then the best idea is to keep it simple. Later on, I'll touch upon different methods and principles contained within this discipline. But to begin with, I just would like to cover a few items that are important. Terminology management is not something that you can do on your own. This is probably one of the reasons that it is so hard to accomplish. So let's begin firstly by looking at what we need in order to understand how to begin. Often, when new customers begin working with us, they have only a basic inkling of the importance of this issue. Actually, I take it back. They understand this issue very well. The problem is, however, that this issue is often tasked to them as part of their job description along with a million other things. And let's face it, if you are a technical writer and you have a deadline, you cannot justify pushing it off in order to put your terminology house in order. So this is where we come in with a solution that at least will address the translation consistency and quality by creating from the available material a basic glossary. So I do want to add this caveat before I dive in here. If you are starting in the middle, then you are not unlike 90% of the companies out there, and you can create an adequate terminology management protocol. And if you engage your LSP with your LSP, and they have experience in helping with this type of undertaking, then you can also get some extra value added there. However, with all this said, it is important to understand that terminology does not begin and end with you. Rather, that in order for the most robust solution to be initiated, it is a collaborative effort that needs to include the stakeholders across multiple departments. While we are creating glossary of terms, what we typically will do is to create a term list based upon extraction of term candidates. In our case, this then goes to the customer for their input. But truthfully, in an ideal world, you would start this at a much earlier stage when you don't even have the word yet, but are at the concept stage. At this stage, it is important to get all the stakeholders on board as to the English term. Let's take a quick look at the term graduated. In graphics, the term graduated fill refers to a color fill that gradually blends from one color to another. Adobe and others refer to this as a gradient fill. So I went to the Microsoft Translation Glossary and looked firstly for graduated, for which I found the results shown. And you'll notice that the results indicate to what product the term can be found in, but more about that later. So you can see here that the word can have more than one meaning even within the same product. So then I looked up gradient, and the TermBase provided me with a more in-depth, again this is the Microsoft TermBase, provided me with a more in-depth information, including a definition, which was lacking when I looked up graduated. So in essence, Microsoft also chooses to use gradient fill rather than graduated fill in the English. And why is this important? Well, as I mentioned, in order to create a robust terminology setup, you will need to get agreement from all the stakeholders. Imagine if the documentation people use graduated fill and the UI people use gradient. There would be massive confusion. It is therefore important to get all the stakeholders from the marketing, development, and technical communications on board. Once you have everyone on board, you will need to then determine the accessibility. This is different, of course, from enrolling the stakeholders, since here you will need to provide access to producers of content, as well as those who will edit and translate the content, and perhaps others too. Now, before we get to the next phase of getting started, I think that it is important for me to describe the typical localization workflow. And here I have simplified it as much as possible. There are basically 5 stages to a project, each having associated activities: preparation, TEP, also known as translation, editing, and proofreading; post-process, this refers to the post-translation activities; QC, and the delivery. In my brief explanation, I'm going to try and boil down the presentation to a minute or two from my usual 2 hours. The preparation stage is where we prepare the content or the files for work. Here is the place where we first address terminology, whether it's getting the customer's prepared terminology or mining it from the material. At this point, I want to go over how we manage terminology for our clients who do not do it themselves. Obviously, we do not have a snapshot of the overall terminology needs of the customer, only our needs in terms of using the terminology for translation purposes. So understand that our process is built to achieve only a small measure of what is needed. The first thing that we do is to mine the data for term candidates. This mining can cover various channels, including, for instance, use of existing glossaries. If, for example, your product is an IT security product, then there are plenty of available glossaries, and we don't need every time to reinvestigate what network security layer is in IT security or what DICOM means in medical imaging. I've already created several what we call generic glossaries, which cover multiple industries and subverticals, so that is the first place I look. Afterwards, we look to the material for localization, the UI, the documentation. From here, we glean term candidates. After we have identified the term candidates, we then add metadata, which will help us manage the terminology better. For example, companies often grow by acquisitions. A company will acquire another company if there's synergy with their business. So often, terms may differ, but mean the same thing. If the terminology differs from product to product, as we saw in the Microsoft example, then we will need to manage it using metadata in order to identify in which product we need to apply what term. Other types of metadata can be a description, version, source, context, part of speech, such as the difference between the word file as a verb or a noun. Once we have provided this, we can then proceed to engaging the customer in their feedback. As I always point out, there is no one who knows your product better than you, and that is why it is always crucial to get the feedback from the client. Once this feedback is received and implemented, we then translate the glossary, which then becomes the TermBase. And this too goes through an approval process, typically by the customer's in-country resources, whether they are reviewers or distributors, etc. Once approved, the terminology is distributed to the appropriate stakeholders or integrated into the translation kits or made available online. This TermBase, incidentally, is also used when doing automated quality checks on the translation. Moving along quickly, we then proceed to the TEP phase, which includes not only the TEP itself, but also quality checks for adherence to the TermBase, as well as consistency, numbers, formats, etc. During this stage, there are typically questions that arise about the terminology, and these need to be managed as well as updating the TermBase with any changes. The post-process can either be the testing of the UI or the generation of the final format for the documentation, for example, online help, user manual, quick start guides, etc. During this stage, there are often new issues, especially in the testing, since this is typically the first time the translation is seen in context. I remember that we started working with a customer which had been working with another vendor for a few years. They had a term base of sorts, but during the testing, one of our testers pointed out there was a term that was completely wrong. The customer said, "Oh, yeah, we know that, but it's been wrong for so long and used incorrectly for so long that if we change it now, our customers won't know what the new function is." This just emphasizes the importance of trying to do it right from the beginning. Once the post-processing is done, the project then goes for final QC, and I can speak more about that offline since it's a world unto itself. This includes monitoring the project for risk and change, and ensuring that the translation assets are updated along the way. This means the translation memory and the TermBase, especially, as well as the files. Suffice it to say that QC is done along the way. After the final QC, the project is delivered and closed. So now at this stage, you're wondering, great, how can I get started on this too? Marita and I both agreed that we'd keep this presentation tool agnostic for two reasons. The first is that if I'm building a house, it doesn't matter if I use a hammer and nails or a nail gun, the house will still get built. And if we recommend, for instance, a nail gun, can we be sure that you use it or that you have the electricity to plug it in? The second reason is that we felt that we wanted to help you get going in the easiest way possible. That is by using what is readily available. Mostly this means starting with a spreadsheet. But before I dive into this, I would like to point out that I have yet to cover the different theoretical approaches to terminology. I will try and cover a theory or two a bit later in the presentation. So looking at this example in front of us, we see that the term candidate appears in the second column. The candidate can be anything that you have identified as a relative term which needs to be addressed consistently and correctly. This can include abbreviations, product names, generic industry terms, etc. It is recommended, too, that you identify the source of the term. In this example, you will see that the first column is marked product, but this could just as easily indicate source. As much as possible, a definition should be provided. You can also add part of speech. This example shown is a very simple example and will go a long way in getting you started. But later on, you may want to add things like synonyms as well. I personally like adding the status of each term because this can help you manage the terminology better. For example, I earlier gave an example of a company which grows by acquisitions. Down the road, they may want to unify the terminology for new releases but maintain old versions. Having a status can help in this regard. One way, for example, is by running a term check on legacy material, and you can then compare the old with the new. The comment field is important, as you may want to communicate special instructions regarding a specific term to the translators. Finally, moving back, you will see the translation field. This obviously is where the translation is entered, and along with the term field forms the core of the term base. So with this basic introduction, I'd like to let Marita have a turn to explain the amazing work she's done at her company. After that, I will cover some theories of terminology.
Well, thank you, David, and hello to everybody. Thank you for your interest in a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And this is why I have a little bit of a provocative title here, saying in the beginning was the word. But after having worked in the localization industry for more than 20 years, this is what I truly believe. Localization is a piece of cake if the source material is well internationalized and your English source is well written. I realize that the source is not always English, but to make things simpler for this presentation, let's assume it is. So in order to write a source well, you need to be clear on terminology as well as on authoring conventions, which is really a different entity and definitely, in my opinion, worth its own webinar, but it's tightly connected to terminology. I will talk in my portion of the presentation about the following three aspects. First, I want to add a few things to what David already mentioned. So I'll be talking about terminology creation. Second, translation of the terminology list. And third, establishing authoring guidelines, which should be added to your terminology list. All three have two things in common. They happen in the English development phase, and that is way before we start localization and require collaboration from various entities within an organization. So let me start with some additions to the terminology list creation that David already elaborated on. So in addition to the fields David already mentioned, I would like to suggest considering adding even more information. In our terminology list, you will find a column for protocol application component. This is where we indicate in which part of the software this particular term occurs for the first time. So for example, one of our products has several protocols. In this field, we specify in which protocol this term occurs for the first time. Depending what gets localized for which language, we can then easily extract the terminology that pertains to each particular software version and each protocol based on this entry. So in our terminology list, you can also find a column for definition explanation. And this is a very similar field to the one that David referred to as meaning. I encourage you to be very specific in this field. In my line of work, we often cross-reference other terms, especially if the term is included because of a distinct usage in English. So let me give you an example. For example, error versus failure. So in my world, error means that the system software didn't function as intended. The root problem could be device or disposable related, or it could be a bug. So in cases like that, I like to add an example from our everyday life whenever possible. So for the definition of error, we communicate something like that. One way to relate to this is to think about what happens when your PC stops functioning. We can all understand that, right? Unless you've got a serious software bug or hardware malfunction, you can usually solve your problem by rebooting. Failure, however, has a completely different consequence. In my field, it is used to describe when a system or software component stops functioning as intended, and it means the end of the procedure. There is no product, there is no happy ending. So you might have to deal with very different terminology in your subject matter field, but I think it is important to consider distinctions between terms that are similar but have distinctive differences and therefore completely different consequences. And then, of course, you have to be consistent with your distinction in the English source, because otherwise there's no point. Another column you might find in our terminology list is context, location in software. In this column, we provide both context and location information. An easy example would be to add to the word cancel that it is a button. The terminology list is also a good place to provide general product information. An example from my world, this device will be used primarily in a hospital. The operator is usually a medical professional. Or, this device will be used primarily in blood processing centers. The operator is usually a blood processing technician. Why is this information useful? Because it helps us to understand our target audience. I might be using more Latin-derived terminology if the device is handled by physicians. They might prefer to talk about, for example, erythrocytes. Lab technicians, however, might prefer to talk about red blood cells. Both terms are perfectly fine. It's just a matter of preference depending on the audience. So I'm showing you a picture. A picture is worth 1,000 words. You all know the saying, so apply it. If you have a picture provided, of course, in addition to your definition, I'm showing you a picture of a roller clamp versus a pinch clamp, and anybody will understand what you're talking about without knowing anything about this particular product. Pictures are very helpful. We usually get our terminology list translated by our reviewers who are subject matter experts with the particular device, and we do this before we start the project. This is also a great opportunity to connect the reviewer with the translators and set them up for future teamwork. We usually resolve terminology disputes or discussions in a conference call with the translator and the reviewer online. This way they get to know each other, they can speak in their own language to each other, they are starting a human relationship, which comes in very handy during the actual translation process and at the latest during the in-country review where teamwork is really essential. A couple more thoughts for food for thought, or while you usually don't find a full sentence in terminology lists, I actually highly recommend that you add 1 or 2 sentences into your term list. An example might be if the patient is connected and the procedure is in progress, touch, rinse back. Well, that really shouldn't be in a terminology list, right? I agree with you, and here is why we do it anyways. This is a good method to get a clear understanding from the reviewer what style he, she wants to use in this particular product and how the user should be addressed, if there's a preference for passive versus active, etc. So once we have this agreement between translator and reviewer, what terminology and what style to use, which is usually after the conference call that I just mentioned, we start with the localization of the software. We don't start before we have that base terminology in place. So David already mentioned this fact, but I would like to reiterate. Quality, and in localization, quality is very much based on good terminology, requires a teamwork effort. I believe it was Hillary Clinton who claimed that it takes a village to raise a child. And I claim something similar for software localization. So it takes a lot of people to work together. One of the reasons for our success in software localization is that we work with all these entities shown on the slide together in order to localize our software successfully. And many of these subject matter experts are actually involved when we create and define terminology for a device. So before I get deeper into the subject, let's get a little entertainment out of this, okay? Well, everybody likes to see some funny translations, and I'm definitely enjoying them. I work in the medical device industry, and without sounding too dramatic, a mistake in translation can be fatal in our industry. So I take this business very seriously. I want to be able to sleep at night, and I want to be sure that our translators are set up for success. Part of this setup for success is the terminology list. Another part are authoring guidelines. So let me dig into this a little further. Our objective is to develop high-quality English content, which we define as consistent, concise, easily understood, audience-appropriate content that can be easily localized. We do a number of things to realize this objective, and one of them is the terminology list, but we go a little further than that and also establish writing conventions or authoring guidelines and reflect them in the terminology list. So here are some thoughts on authoring guidelines. I'm just giving you a couple of examples what I mean by that. Depending on what material you are creating, your authoring guidelines might look completely different from my examples. My message here is create guidelines and stick to them. It will help you to create consistent, concise, easily understood, audience-appropriate content that can be easily localized. So in this particular example, we talk about verb tenses. So in our software, we have phrases and sentences on our GUI, and we are very specific when we use present tense versus past tense or future tense. Another example would be capitalization, and it's probably one of our most difficult guidelines to establish. English has many rules, and I know from our English content developers that their reference manual contains 65 pages on capitalization. So people in our organization, and I'm one of them, have very strong opinions and feelings about what should and what should not be capitalized. Guidelines help maintain consistency as well as help users understand what to expect to see on the screen. When our users read the instruction, go to the main run screen in lowercase as shown on this slide, they will know that the name main run screen does not appear on the screen because it's not capitalized. The same with the pause button, also illustrated on this slide. When users see the instruction touch the pause button, they will know not to look for a button that says pause. So when I started 7 years ago at Terumo VCT, back then it was Gamble, we had no process in place. And this is why at the very beginning of our presentation I said I had the pleasure to create a software localization team. Back then localization was done on the side by development. The good news is it's doable. It took us a while, but now we have a process that facilitates global-ready English content by teamwork with English content developers and our engineering development. We create a terminology list in teamwork with English content developers. It's very well defined and it will have pictures. This terminology list gets translated by one of our subject matter experts who will also review this particular product once it's localized. It also gets looked at from a linguistic point of view by the translator. Terminology goes way beyond just this list. It requires that the English content developer creates conventions and sticks to them throughout the component. These conventions get handed off to the translation team once the material is ready to get localized. So everybody involved has a clear understanding of the meaning beyond the words. So while I'm a strong believer in process and tools and technology, the emphasis is on understanding what is needed in people working together. So finally, I want to show you a personal localization experience. I took this picture when I was living in China. And I kind of was expecting alligators, but we were on top of a hill, and so the sign just meant to say, do not slip. And with this, beware of missing foot. I'm going to be handing off to David again.
All right, David, are you?
Thank you, Marita. Just to take what you said further, not only should you examine the source, but look also at how the source impacts the target. For instance, here in this example, which I found only a couple of days ago, you will see that Air France did a pretty good job at translating the content from French, obviously. The message is conveyed in a manner in which a native speaker can appreciate. The only problem I see here, though, is that I'm not sure if Air France is actually selling tickets to Guangzhou for $1.18 and 6 pence of a cent. Well, you can get away with that in an ad for an airline. Now imagine the same scenario with a medical device. How confident would you be as a patient if you knew that the same care that went into that short translation is being used for something like this? So we see here that there is an imperative to look fully at the entire translation and localization process in a holistic way and as carefully as possible. Examine each input, whether it's glossary, training, qualifications, style guidelines, and so on. I want to take a little lesson from how you can start. The first thing I want to look at, and if I'm going to take an industry which one might think is trivial, but that in and of itself will help us emphasize just how critical this is, and I also give us a good indication of what factors to consider. What you're looking at here is a term base created for the online gambling industry. The one-word term draw can have several meanings, even in gambling. Field 1 defines for us the industry, and the column explanation is the definition. Only after the linguist understands both of these can he or she accurately give the corresponding term in the target language. The complexity of a seemingly banal term emphasizes for us the importance of more complex terms and more complex industries, not to take anything away from the online interactive entertainment industry. There are 4 principal ISO standards which I'm going to reference for this webinar: ISO 1087, ISO 860, ISO 10241, and ISO 704. Most of what I'm going to speak about for the next few minutes may be found in ISO 1087, and this is a good reference for getting started. According to ISO, entry number, preferred term, and definition are the mandatory elements of each entry, and other elements will appear only when appropriate. Essentially, this means that you need to number each entry for the purpose of managing it, and the only other two requirements are for the term itself and the definition. So here you can see that by adding a minimum amount of data and metadata, you can get yourself started on the road to managing monolingual terminology. In terminology work, there are two types of categories of terms, objects and concepts. An object is defined as anything perceived or conceived. Some objects, such as a car, a building, a mountain, and so on, these are concrete or material. Others, such as financial planning, gravity, and so on, may be considered abstract, and still others, for example, literary characters, may be considered purely imaginary. According to ISO, in the course of producing a terminology, philosophical discussions on whether an object actually exists in reality are unproductive and should be avoided. Attention should be focused on how one deals with the objects for the purposes of communication. Concepts, of course, are not abstract or imagined objects. Example, Harry Potter is imaginary, and to my best knowledge, he's not a concept yet, like a Kleenex, for example, might be a concept. So a concept can be considered something like freedom, and may, in a certain context, be conceptualized mentally by use of a symbol. For example, when you see a picture such as the one here, you don't necessarily think about a statue or copper, but rather about the concept of freedom or liberty. And really, it does not even matter much which country you come from. So how do we differentiate between the types of concepts and why this is important? Well, an individual concept may be a specific planet, such as Saturn, whereas the general concept is planets. In addition, we tend to need to understand why something like this is important, and if you're going to implement it in your day-to-day implementation. So what is it? Well, I'm going to just read the screen. It fits in the palm of your hand, has a long cord-like object attached, is functional for other beings in terms of allowing other beings to work for their food, play, and is sometimes given as gifts, although the recipient may not appreciate this type of gift. That's right, a mouse. I meant this kind of mouse, sorry. Okay, so you get the point. And as Marita pointed out, you need to provide much more context when creating terminology, and examining the way in which we build the terms is important in getting another perspective in. I really wanted to get more into how we build a concept ladder and understand better relationships, but as I was preparing this presentation, I realized that it was getting a bit long. So I think that this is a good place to end by showing a now complete basic glossary. I must emphasize that this is very basic. If you want more information about advanced functions, feel free to shoot either Marita or myself an email. So here we see the basic information inputted. And of course, once you have the glossary, or some of us call it a monolingual glossary, you can then have the term translated, and it then can serve as your term base. So if this is you, you really should not worry. You will need some help here, but it's not an impossible undertaking. There are a few simple steps. You will need to, firstly, create a monolingual glossary, then perform consistency checks on TM with easily available tools like QA Distiller, data mine the TM for the translations, and then validate the terms and their translations with your in-country people. And that's sort of how you get started in the middle. If you're deep into your translation process and you've been doing it for a few years, but you want to ratchet it up in terms of quality, that's a pretty good place to start. So in closing, the 5 takeaways I'd like to emphasize here are that proper terminology is essential for successful translation. You shouldn't rely just on the fact that all translators know the source and target languages. It's easy to get started. Resources are available to help you. And even if you're currently translating, you can still rectify the situation. And you should always enjoy what you do. Just a 1 10-second blurb about NetTranslators. NetTranslators is an award-winning localization provider, having been ranked #1 in translation services by top 10 reviews for 3 years in a row. Back to you, Chris.
Great, thanks a lot, guys. That was very interesting. Now I'd like to invite, we still have a little bit of time for Q&A. So if you have any questions for Marita and or David, please use the Q&A chat or chat interface on your right-hand side. Marita, question for you. What tool do you use?
What tool do we use? We use a simple Excel spreadsheet. And I actually don't think it matters what tool you use. Other people use other tools. it's the old garbage in, garbage out philosophy. So what is important is the content. It's not so important what tool you use. That's my humble personal opinion.
Right. Actually, on that topic, how do you manage version control if you do Excel spreadsheets?
You know, version control, I talked a little bit about that. We have per product or per protocol a column in there. And so when we're adding terminology to it, it would be for the next protocol. And so we can very clearly identify what has been added for our first protocol, for the second, for the third. Or, you know, if we do versions, we have, you know, the versions in that particular column, and this is how we keep track of our Excel spreadsheets. They live on a SharePoint site, so we have a very clear version history. We annotate it, you know, when we have a new version, but it's, you know, it's kind of a twofold way to figure out which version we need. Either you go to the SharePoint site, figure out what we put into the version history node, and or you use the product information.
Okay, and then
Does that make sense?
yes, thanks a lot. Another question.
And Chris, to add something to what Marita had said, that pretty much is how the ISO 1087 tells you to do it. There's a field that they recommend for deprecated terms, and that's where you could sort of manage you know, historical uses of different terms for the same thing.
Marita, how many languages do you manage through your Excel spreadsheets? Question from Edith.
Okay, so this is a little bit more of a complex question. So we do 20 plus languages usually for our products. But at the end of our translation, so once we're done with the localization of a product, we are deleting the column that has the translated term in it. So be very clear, we're only deleting the translated term. You know, we keep that translated column until we are at the end of the localization phase. So after the in-country review, we are deleting that column and we refer to the TM, to the translation memory at that point for this particular version to get terminology. So it is really our terminology list last, the translation portion of it lasts exclusively through the duration of the localization phase. And let me tell you why that is. We have tried to do this differently, but at each and every for each and every project we found out at the end that we changed something during the in-country review, and then all of a sudden we had to rely on a human person and a human being to update the terminology list. And I tell you, we human beings are just not 100% perfect. So very often we missed a little something that was changed at the very end during the in-country review, and this is why we came to the conclusion to use the terminology list, you know, with all fields at all times, but delete the translation column at the end of the localization phase. Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks a lot. Let me see. Is there a tool that you use that lays on your authoring tool to ensure terminology is used properly?
No, we are not using a tool. It is again human beings working with, and you know, in our industry there is very, very specific terminology. You know, I might have on one term a scientific explanation of 5 pages, and I'm not exaggerating, okay? So I have to just get this definition down to something that, you know, regular people, regular translators can understand. So there is no specific tool that we use. We pick our terminology based on, you know, maybe frequency, but also based on what is difficult to translate? What do you really need to understand in order to render that term in another language? And we're lucky enough to have resources in-house that can do that based on whatever content we're looking at. It's not done by a tool.
Okay, great. I think sort of partially already addressed, but how do you resolve conflicts in the term context to choose which is the preferred translation?
Yeah, I think I already mentioned that during my presentation. So when we have a certain term, we always make sure that our reviewers are involved in this. And so we make sure that, it's the definition is clarified, A, when we create the English terminology list, and then when we talk to our reviewers about the translation.
Great, great.
Am I answering your question? I'm not sure if that was a little bit more. Yeah?
Yes, definitely. Let me see. How do you integrate your glossary spreadsheet with CAT tools?
We are providing our terminology to our translators, and they can integrate it into if they're using charters, they're using, what is it called, a multi-term. For example, if they use another CAT tool, they just integrate it as an Excel spreadsheet into whatever that particular TM tool requires for integration. Some translators, and I know that for a fact, are actually not integrating it into their TM tool and are having yet an additional application, an Excel spreadsheet, where they are looking up terminology for definition.
Great, great. Actually, I have a question for David. David, I used to work in localization for a long time. I also did sales, sales support, project management. I always found it hard. Terminology management or creation of a terminology list was always one of the line items that we tried to include, but clients were a little bit hesitant when it came to that line item. How do you sell creating a terminology list?
Well, typically it would depend. Earlier I mentioned that the classic example that I give is file. File can be mean something could be a wood file, a nail file, it could be a computer file, it could be a paper file, it could be a file at the IRS. It could be a criminal file. It could be so many different things. And if you take file and throw it into Google Translate into French, you'll find 16 different translations. So I say, okay, well, what's the first thing that you want to do? You look at your simplest, most basic word, and yes, of course, we use Microsoft glossaries and everything. But if whatever product you're selling, the reason you're going to different locales is because you have something different and something new for that locale, and you have some value added. So, what you're saying, if you don't commit yourself to terminology and the creation of terminology, then, you're essentially not committing yourself to your product in full. That's the first thing I say. Whether or not management understands that, because, let's face it, there are localization companies and there's translation companies. And if you're looking at doing it right, as Marita said, she does localization, she doesn't do translation. It's a whole different scope. So, when a company is just starting out, they say, oh, we got to translate it. They don't realize that they're talking about localizing. So, unfortunately, we have to do a lot of education in those terms, because, as you mentioned, it is a line item, and it's very difficult when you have to compete with companies that aren't committed to that process of creating a good infrastructure in localization.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, we're going to take one more question. We're already a little bit over time. Last question from Alex. Could you please share any best practices or advice on how to deal with feature names and product names, such as terms?
Is that a question for Marita or for me?
I think either, maybe both of you, some last thoughts. So could you please share any best practice or advice on how to deal with feature names and product names as terms?
So let me just chime in from my experience in the medical device industry. We are not translating product names, so product names usually stay in English in our world. Feature names, it very much depends. Sometimes we translate them and sometimes we don't. It very much depends on, where the application goes to. So we have a couple of applications that are more used in I'm going to say, in a very modern world versus, our embedded devices. They are more used in a very traditional, medical device world. So in that case, we would translate them. if it is more a feature that everybody is already familiar with, from maybe using iTunes or something, you know, we don't translate it. I don't know best practices. I would need to have a little bit more need to talk about that. I'm not really sure what the question is.
I would chime in as well that you also have to differentiate between a generic feature, you know, copy and paste. That's a sort of a generic feature. But you might want to say, you know, quick copy paste might be your special feature. So now you have to differentiate between how you're going to handle generic features and how you're going to handle specific features. And, you know, the best thing to do is to look at what it would mean for your users, even to the level of that particular locale. And you know, as Marita said, she has her her reviewers who are experts, field experts, work together on the translation of the terminology because they know much more about what's going in that particular in that particular market. So it's, you know, you have to really examine in you know, your each term really in a complete complete way. But you know, I'll give one caveat. I would say that maybe you know, not even 10% of the companies out there are managing the terminology in an adequate manner, and maybe only 2% are doing it in a full-blown process of managing terminology.
Great, thanks a lot. And we want to be respectful of everybody's time. We're already a little bit over. This we didn't get to all the questions. If you have any burning questions left for Marita or David, please email them directly. This said, Marita and David, one last thought on this topic before we wrap it up here.
I hope you have as much fun doing this work as I do, because I really love it. Even after 20 years, I'm enjoying doing this, and you know, you make progress and you can produce something that is well localized, and it makes me happy.
Great, thanks.
Right, I'll concur with Marita. If you're not having fun in this business, then you haven't then you haven't fulfilled the ultimate of what you can get out of localization. It's about communicating. It's about getting your important product out to people and making it accessible to them.
Great, thanks a lot. All right, this said, Marita, thank you very much. David, thank you very much. Everybody who attended today, thanks so much. Join us again next time, and you'll be receiving the link to the recording of this webinar. Everybody, have a great day. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.